During the second half of the 20th century, large artillery ships resembled one of the heroes from the legend about David and Goliath. A dreaded warrior named Goliath, who wore shiny heavy armor and carried a huge sword, but who was easily defeated by a stone from young David's slingshot. The stone turned into a missile, and the frail boy who challenged the giant became a missile boat at sea.
A battleship can spot an approaching missile at a distance of around 30 kilometers.
Their names accurately describe their combat tactics: pop out of nowhere, sting the target, and fly away.
So if the charge hits the ship's propulsion or magazine after passing through the deck, the destruction of the ship will be inevitable.
This boat, R-47, also known as Tambovskiy Komsomolets, is a large missile boat of Project 1241-1. She was designed to destroy enemy surface warships, as well as landing and transport vessels out at sea and in the vicinity of bases. Guarding Allied ships and vessels against surface threats can be also included in the list of tasks the missile boat was intended to carry out. Boats of this project have been built in the USSR and Russian Federation since 1979, and they serve in the Navy of Russia and other countries even today. Project 1241-1 missile boat, NATO name Taranto. At the beginning of the 1980s, the construction of such a large boat of that type was called for the needs of the times.
At that time, boats of the previous projects had run out of their upgrade capabilities and couldn't have new armaments fitted. A boat that could carry more powerful artillery and anti-aircraft armament was needed. In addition, a new missile required a new launch pad.
By that time, the Soviet Navy already had huge experience in deploying missile boats and unique methods for their construction, starting with the first boats in the 1950s, Project 183R.
It was necessary to install a missile on a boat and, at the same time, to do so rapidly and cheaply. The prototype was for Project 183 torpedo boat. Naval engineers placed 2 containers on the boat and installed a fire control system. The efficiency of that solution was proven as early as in October 1967. During the course of the War of Attrition, a squadron of Egyptian missile boats stationed at their harbor opened fire at an Israeli destroyer and sank her without even leaving the harbor.
Next was the Project 205 missile boat. She was different from her predecessor in terms of her size, propulsion, and armament. There were several variants of the boat.
If you imagine the branch of missile boat development, it splits into 2 branches after Project 205. The first branch presented classic missile boats, and the second one included small-sized missile ships. Project 205 was followed by Project 1241, Molniya, Russian for lightning, NATO name Taranto.
R-47 missile boat, Project 12411, NATO name Taranto. Performance characteristics. Length 56 meters, width slightly more than 10 meters. Top draft to the lower propeller edge more than 3.5 meters. Total displacement 493 tons. Main propulsion plant: 2 M510 diesel engines, 2 M70 gas turbines. Total power of the gas turbines 24,000 HP. Total power of the diesel engines 8,000 HP. Top speed 41 knots. Armament: 4 Musket anti-ship cruise missile launchers, NATO name SSN-22 Sunburn. 76.2mm AK-176 dual-purpose main gun. Anti-aircraft artillery: 2 AK-630M 6-barrel artillery mounts. Cruising range: 1,600 miles at a speed of 14 knots. Project 1241-1 was also different in the way the ship's crew was accommodated. The commander had a separate compartment, the officers 2 double rooms. 2 compartments with room for 3 to 4 people were provided for ensigns, and 3 rooms served as crew quarters for sailors. The boat had a heating and cooling system, a mess hall for the crew, individual lavatories and shower rooms. According to calculations, the displacement of the new missile boats increased twofold compared to Project 205. This came as a result of improving the accommodation conditions on these boats. In the 1980s, people in the Soviet Navy used to say that there was almost a trend of turning warships into cruise ships in terms of comfort on board. It was planned to use Project 1241 as the basis of an entire array of boats, missile, anti-ship and Coast Guard boats, and use a common hull for all of them. Needs of the times became the main expression used in relation to the development of missile armament. Following World War II, radar for the detection, tracking, and recognition of naval targets made it possible to spot an enemy beyond the operating range of powerful weapons, and new defense systems negated the advantages of surprise torpedo attacks.
Prior to the beginning of the 1970s, only the USSR and Sweden were involved in the development of anti-ship missiles. Those anti-ship missiles were Termite in the USSR, NATO name Styx or SSN-2, and Robot in Sweden. The first combat deployment of the missiles during the War of Attrition demonstrated their efficiency. As a result, Israel became the first country that commissioned anti-ship missiles into service after Sweden and the USSR. Their missile was named Gabriel. Anti-ship missiles appeared in service in the USA and other NATO countries only in the mid-1970s.
New design solutions were required to place missile systems on board ships. Some key questions needed answers. How could it be possible to compensate for the impact of gas jets from missile launch engines on ship structures and neutralize rocking?
If we recall the exterior of the 183R missile boat, the launchers were installed at the aft. So the gas jets were hitting the water. Gas conduits were mounted. These were additional plates that made the engine flame blow with an inclination and not straight. Moreover, all the boat's superstructures were made of an aluminium-magnesium alloy. So when the missile left the container, even if the boat was rocking, the missile stabilized itself to 0 in the air. If the rocking motion was strong and the missile couldn't be stabilized using the fins while leaving the container, the missile was launched when at the minimal distance from the 0 point. The launch was made in an automatic mode. In this case, the missile left the container and used its fins to stabilize itself.
In the mid-1970s, missile boats of the countries that were considered as potential enemies of the USSR surpassed similar Soviet boats in terms of their combat performance. Moreover, they could fight against not only the Project 205 boats, but also the P-15 anti-ship missile while it was on approach to its target. The arms race dictated its terms. The issue of striking an enemy with a missile from a distance greater than the detection range of enemy radio electronics became crucial. The Project 1241 missile boat totally satisfied that task in terms of all of her characteristics, starting with her displacement and ending with her target designation systems, which were more advanced than those of her predecessors.
The boat was equipped with more powerful, brand new diesel gas turbine propulsion systems that helped increase the boat's cruising range and speed. The boat allowed for the installation of more powerful artillery, anti-aircraft and missile armaments, as well as radio-electronic warfare and fire control systems.
The greater displacement she had compared to her predecessor made it possible to mount more advanced artillery on board, AK-176 and AK-630 automatic mounts.
The AK-630 automatic mount houses small-caliber anti-aircraft artillery, while the AK-176 automatic mount is capable of fighting against enemy ships and can also be employed as an anti-aircraft artillery, depending on the type of shell that's loaded. But it's important to understand that engaging in an artillery battle against such ships as destroyers, frigates and corvettes is almost impossible because of the operating range of their armaments. You simply wouldn't be able to approach them because they have a weapon system installed that are capable of firing over distances of 20 to 30 kilometers. Because of this, the boat's primary weapon against large ships was still the missile system. However, if the boat engaged a minesweeper operation in the area, it would be sufficient to employ the AK-176 mount against it so as not to waste an entire missile on a small ship.
In the 1980s, the navy of the nation that was most likely to be the primary enemy of the Soviets at that point in time was reinforced with 4 upgraded battleships. Under some specific circumstances, one might imagine that the naval paths of a steel giant and the missile boat could have crossed.
A battleship can spot an approaching missile at a distance of around 30 kilometers. The anti-aircraft armament available on board, the Volcano Fallon automatic anti-aircraft gun, most probably wouldn't be able to counter a target traveling at the very fast speed of Mach 2.8. The missile can perform evasive maneuvers, such as an S maneuver and high pass. In other words, coming at a target from above. So the missile most probably would easily pass through the battleship's anti-aircraft defenses and strike its target.
The main caliber of the Project 1241-1 missile boat comprises 4 P-270 Moskit, NATO name SSN-22 Sunburn, supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles that are installed in 2 twin launchers on each side. The anti-ship missiles, a reliable and dangerous weapon of the Soviet Navy, had traveled a long road of trials and upgrades since the end of the 1950s, by the time they were commissioned in the mid-1980s.
The 3M80 missile has a launch weight of more than 4 tons. The missile strikes its target at a speed of Mach 2.8. If we consider the weight of the burnt fuel, the missile's weight is around 2.5 tons when it hits the ship. The missile's warhead is a penetrator and high explosive. It carries a pretty powerful explosive charge of 150 kilograms, while the total weight of the missile is 320 kilograms. All the rest is metal parts. The warhead's design allows it to penetrate armor of significant thickness. Striking a turret is almost useless. A turret's armor is very heavy and durable, so the high-explosive penetrator warhead of the missile would be unlikely to make it through. However, if a heavy missile does hit a turret, just imagine 2.5 tons traveling at a speed of Mach 2.8. There's a high chance that the turret will be jammed. The turret will be incapacitated and won't be able to fire. When the Moskit missile hits the superstructures, there's a high probability that all fire control posts will be destroyed. The ship will lose all of her direct command and control capabilities, and she won't be able to fire either her anti-aircraft weapons or manned battery guns. If the missile strikes the side of the ship, it will most probably break through the plating and frames, and will enter the interior of the ship nicely. The warhead will be next to get inside, and it contains 150 kilograms of explosives, which is not TNT, by the way. It's a close equivalent to a 500-kilogram high-explosive bomb. In this case, if the explosion happens around the boiler turbine power plant, the ship will most likely be incapacitated and unable to move. If the explosion happens in close proximity to the magazine, the ship might even blow up. If the missile hits the deck actually is the most interesting spot. The durability of the missile's warhead is enough to penetrate 127mm thick armor. So if the charge hits the ship's propulsion or magazine after passing through the deck, the destruction of the ship will be inevitable. In this situation, the battleship could respond to the missile boat only with the Tomahawk cruise missile. However, using such a missile against this boat would be very expensive and unwise. The battleship's main guns don't have the range to hit the boat. If we assume that the battleship engages a missile boat division, we can confidently presume that in case of a mass launch and multiple hits, the battleship will definitely be destroyed. A direct confrontation between our missile boat and a battleship is highly unlikely, because the battleship would typically be part of an aircraft carrier strike force. The missile boat would be destroyed before she could approach the attack line, while numerous missiles could easily be shot down by the strike force missile defense system. However, the missile's characteristics would allow it to deal very serious damage to the battleship.
It's no coincidence that Soviet missile boats were named Wasp and Mosquito. Their names accurately describe their combat tactics: pop out of nowhere, sting the target, and fly away.
The potential of the Project 1241 missile boats hasn't been depleted even now. The boats are maintained in combat readiness and represent a real threat to any probable enemy.
More than 100 boats of that project have been built. They served not only in the Soviet Navy, but were also exported to numerous other countries. Despite their old age, the missile boats of the project still serve in the Russian Navy, as well as the navies of numerous countries across the world.
Today, the R-47 missile boat is moored at the harbour of Kronstadt as a museum boat. Almost 20 missile boats of Project 1241-1 still serve in the Navy of the Russian Federation. The capabilities of the missile boats of that class are still far from being depleted. The boats designed for Project 1241-8, which represents the development of the Taranto class, are still being built for navies, both Russian and foreign.